The Chesapeake Bay watershed is primarily forested. About 60% of the lands in the watershed is forested. It's a huge watershed. It's 64,000 square miles compared to a relatively small bay. So obviously the Mississippi watershed and all of its rivers is much larger than the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but that flows into the Gulf of Mexico, which is also a very large body of water. Versus the Chesapeake Bay, while it's the largest estuary in the world, it's still relatively small. So it's sort of the amount of land that flows into a body of water that you want that's relatively small. So the potential for pollution increases due to that. The average depth of the bay is only about 20 feet deep, and the population that we have here in the Baltimore, Washington area is about 16 million people in that region. In this region. The bay itself is a huge, these estuaries tend to be highly productive bodies of water that are really good at making fish, okay? And so the fishery of Maryland and Virginia is over a $3 billion industry per year. There's a lot, because we have this large population, there's obviously a large infrastructure of water and sewer that goes into it, and that's really important for the citizenry. And there's a lot of waterfront property, a lot of very beautiful waterfront property that people want to protect the value of that property itself. So the bay is important in many different ways and regions. So one of the biggest challenges for the bay is this area in red in the middle of the bay, and that shows where there's a low oxygen in the, and that's in the bottom waters of the bay, and it's really quite extensive. What you guys have probably heard about is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Sometimes it's like the size of Rhode Island, sometimes it's the size of Connecticut. They always kind of compare it to a size state in the Gulf of Mexico. In the bay, it's also really quite significant in that the bottom waters of the bay lose or reduce in oxygen, and fish basically can't live in low oxygen water. In fact, fish need pretty high oxygenated water. And so that has an impact on where fish could spend their time. There's historic overfishing. I'll go into an example of that. There's huge population growth, and there's a tremendous amount of suburbia and suburbanization that hasn't always used the best land use methods. Some of it's quite old, so maybe that wasn't expected. Some of it's still the policies aren't necessarily meeting the population that's at hand. And so one of the big key habitats are oysters and oyster reefs. So oysters grow on top of each other and they form this reef structure. You'll see in the beginning of that bar graph, in the 1880s, this is catch records, to the early 1900s. Basically, there was already a crash in the catch. And it's really kind of a classic example of overfishing. And the causes of that, one, was that when trains came on board, and you could get a train from Baltimore and New York in one day, oysters they spoil quite easily. So you need to eat them, right after you need to kill them basically to eat them raw, or you need to cook them right away after you kill them. And so you were able to take a train in the late 1880s from Baltimore to New York. You could ice up the train, ice up your oysters, bring them to the big market. Same with Philadelphia, bring them to that big market. So immediately there was a large crash in the oyster population. Today it's only at 0.3% of its historic levels. Now that has a couple different ramifications. One, oysters filter the water. They're essentially sucking in all this water and taking out the algae in the water, and I'll get to why that's important later. But two, they are also, we don't have a rocky tidal zone like the New England area. Oyster reefs are basically the only hard substrate on the bottom, or else it's sand or mud. And so all these other critters like to live in these zones are dependent upon oyster reefs. In fact, watermen, our our historic fishermen, we call them watermen there, they would call oyster reefs rock. Hey, is that a rock over there? And because that's basically the only quote unquote hard structure you're going to hit. But they would want to know that because that's where they want to go fishing, right, for the oysters. The other classic problem with the oyster is their basic life system, which is not swimming. They go on another oyster, they glue themselves to that oyster, and they never leave again. So once you find a population of oysters, they're very easy to fish out because you're not gonna leave. You put a float there and mark the area, and you go back the next day and you get more. It's that simple. Bay grasses. So these are underwater grasses that, much like our lawns, but they live underwater. They need, like our lawns, they need a lot of light. And all this algae can also block out the light. These grasses are really important because they are refugia for fish and small crabs. Blue crabs, Chesapeake Bay blue crab is also a big eaten item, as well as small striped bass, another big high-value fish. And the small guys all stay within these grass areas because it's harder for the big fish to get in there and find them to eat them, right? So they're using that for protection. The grasses in the, really throughout this restoration period were kind of low and getting worse into the 90s, really started increasing, and in 08 and 10 had some of the biggest years. And there's always going to be this variation where we're going to have low years and high years, or low years, but hopefully we're going to have some sustained high grass populations. Land use in Maryland, I'll just go through these. This is 1972, 2002, 2030 of what we expect. So the red means higher population. We expect the population to get above 20 million, 22 million soon enough. So we have this tidal, it's a tidal system, but the ocean actually is much cleaner than the bay. So when the ocean as the ocean comes in, it's actually really clean water, and I'll show you that in a slide in a bit. So the big challenge we have is nutrient over-enrichment. Just quite simply, on the right side is current conditions. We have a lot of algae. We have no oxygen during the summertime in our bottom waters. We have less grass, although it's coming back, fewer oysters, and that offers a lot of challenges. On the right side is which was historic and which we're trying to move to, which is less algae and better algae that the fish like, producing a lot of fish with a lot of grass and a lot of oysters. That's where we're trying to get to. And the nutrients, as you guys probably well know, are coming from all sectors. And I want to be really clear about this. And it's something that we all struggle with all the time. Stop having everyone point fingers. Nutrients are coming from everywhere, right? So first of all, it's coming through the rain, oftentimes from our smokestacks that are producing a lot of the energy that we use. On the East Coast is coming from the Midwest, a lot of it is. And that's the smokestacks, the predominant winds are to the east, and so we're getting a lot of nutrients from the air, from the atmospheric sources. We're getting it from septics and lawns, and because we didn't do a good job in suburbanization in a lot of areas, we have a lot more septic systems than we probably should. We have huge wastewater treatment plants. That's actually a real positive part of the story. I'll get to that. And we have agriculture. And most of our agriculture in Maryland, and I should say most of my talk is going to be Maryland-centric. That's what I'm most familiar with. Although it's about the whole Bay restoration effort, but I'm going to talk about Maryland's part of that. And in Maryland, I did look at a USDA map, and there are some cattle farms, mostly dairy, but it's very, very small. And it's probably, you add it all up, it's probably less than a modest county in Iowa in terms of production. However, poultry is huge, as I mentioned. So what are we working on and toward, and where I think the Midwest part of the U.S. and Iowa is going to? And we've been working, in partnership with the federal government and the other states within the Bay region to meet the Clean Water Act standards. The Clean Water Act delegates the right for pollution control to the states. And so the states are under pressure by the federal government to reduce pollution to make the bay ultimately what's called fishable and swimmable. You know, we have to implement basic pollution controls. These are done by state governments, local governments, individuals, et cetera, and there's a variety of state and federal funding to help support those efforts. You guys know probably a little bit about NPDES permits and how, you know, in the 1970s it was really focused on wastewater treatment plants. Then it went to stormwater systems, and then it went to what we now call CAFOs. And in Maryland, we have what are called MAFOs. So their standard is slightly more strict, and it takes in poultry at slightly more strict levels than the feds would define poultry. So some of our houses that are about 150,000 birds, and I can't quite remember the acreage that that amount of birds would be on, would maybe considered a MAFO and may have some extra regulatory controls that they have to go through. Basically, why I was asked earlier if I travel a lot and if I like to give talks, I do. It's not only because I get to meet a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives, but it's also because we've been at this for 30 years. We still haven't solved all of our problems. We know that these problems exist throughout the world. To the extent lessons learned from our region could be applied to another region to shorten their amount of time, that would be great, right? Because at the end of the day, we all want to meet the rules, regulations that we need to, because the ultimate goal is that, you know, is sustainability of our environment and resources throughout. The sources of nitrogen and phosphorus into the bay are from, as I said, multiple sources. Just kind of quickly on nitrogen, it's about 40% of the nitrogen right now is coming from the agricultural community, 33% from atmospheric deposition, and about 20% from wastewater treatment plants. For phosphorus, it's still about a little bit more than 20% coming from wastewater treatment plants, but agriculture is a little bit more, depending upon some legacy issues, probably about 50 to 55% of the phosphorus is coming from the ag sector, and very little from atmospheric sources. It also really matters about where you live. The darker colors here signify that where that nutrient originated and how it gets to the bay makes a difference. So the purpose of this slide is just to say that geography matters, and that you might be on the eastern shore of Maryland and that peninsula area versus the western shore of Maryland, and for a variety of reasons, the nutrients move faster and more from the eastern region than the western region. And we need to take that into account in how we do programs. So that means not every program from a geographic perspective may be equal. We might need to focus more money or give bonus payments because we know it's going to have a bigger impact to get people to change behavior. So ultimately, the goal is to reduce pollutants to achieve the water quality necessary to support the aquatic living resources and to protect human health. We're in a multi-step process where, as I said in an earlier slide, let me just go back. We started this in the 1980s. We had this agreement, as was mentioned, where we said by the year 2000, we're going to achieve water quality goals. We got to the year 2000, we didn't do it. So in 2000, they said, well, let's make some new goals. Let's make 2010 goals. And if we don't make it then we'll start into a regulatory framework on this total maximum daily load. So we got to 2010. We were approaching 2010, realizing that we weren't going to achieve it. And then, so some behaviors started to change, recognizing that by 2025, if we don't meet water quality goals, then the federal government is prepared to take over permitting of NPDES permits and municipal wastewater treatment plants and set those standards. And no one wants that, and I'm pretty sure the federal government doesn't want that. So there is pressure on us to achieve some things. So I'm going to go about how we've changed some behavior. And one of the main ways, and this is probably no different than what you may do on your own farms in terms of a management system, an adaptive management system. I'm a scientist, so I like to start off on the monitoring part of this cycle. Down here, we collect all this data that says what the water quality is like. How many nutrients are in the water, how much oxygen is in the water, what critters are living there, are they healthy or not. We have to evaluate that. We use it to improve understanding of the bay system itself. We then go into policy planning. Okay, how are we going to try to make that better? We implement those things, and then we monitor the implementation to see if we've made a difference or not. And we kind of keep running through this cycle. This isn't rocket science. You know, these management systems have been in place forever. But I got to tell you, the lexicon used to be in the 1990s and early 2000s, well, we're spending a lot of money on it, so it's just working. It must be working, right? And much like you do, you hear all these weather reports, and it sounds like it's a great day, and you walk outside, and it's like, darn it, it's raining, you know? That's kind of what happened in the Bay, where we did all this really cool analysis, and everyone said, it must be getting better. And then we went out and we measured it, and we really looked at the monitoring data, and it was better, but it wasn't as much better. It's because we weren't really looking at what was going on in the water as carefully as we needed to be. So we've gone to this whole concept of statting, and very quickly on statting, just one point, you know, this is a concept that started with police chiefs in New York City, and they were looking at an increase in crime rate, even though they were spending more and more money on enforcement. And they were trying to figure out what was going on. When they really looked at the data, they realized that police officers don't want to work in high crime neighborhoods, right? So they were actually spending more money, but putting less of it into the high crime neighborhoods. Why is that? Because policemen don't want to get injured. They don't want to put themselves at risk. But the reality is the crime rate was getting worse. So it wasn't until they really started boring down into the data where they really understood some of the behavior changes and how to implement change and really ask a lot of questions. And ultimately, the crime rate in New York City went down drastically over time. And that's because they started putting resources to where the problems were, not where it was just nice to put resources. So part of this whole statting concept is to assess where you're at, coordinate across agencies, which is often difficult, target the limited resources you have, and then keep it a very public process. And so, so that the broader population understands what you're trying to achieve, because ultimately the public is paying for a lot of, not only is the private sector paying for a lot, but the public is often doing a lot of cost share. They're paying for a lot of the services as well. And so you got to keep it as public as possible. So we're using the statting process to track health, causes of the problem, and then solutions, and see where we go. So this gets to your question about the ocean itself. I don't know, up here it doesn't quite look green, but basically it's a scale from green, yellow, red being bad, green being the best. This bottom ocean area here, bottom of the bay area is in green. That's primarily because this ocean water is coming in. It's cold water. It's cool. It's typically colder than the bay itself, and it's also has a lot less pollutants in it than the bay does. And so that area often is in much better shape. That ocean water, because it's cooler and it has more salt in it, tends to stay on the bottom of the bay, and as it moves up the bay, it's staying on the bottom, whereas the fresh water is staying on the surface of the bay, typically. So the mouth of the bay there is about 24 miles at the bridge tunnel. If you've ever done this really cool bridge tunnel, if you're ever in the region, I highly recommend it. You go through 2 tunnels while you're on a bridge. And that's so the military, which is, you know, the East Coast military is largely based in Florida and Norfolk, Virginia. So Norfolk boats can get in without worrying about a height limit. So they put the cars underneath the bay itself. But so it's under the 2 channels that you drive in a tunnel. So we do this report card every year, so we know that we're making sure that we're using the monitoring data to assess how we're doing, and then we do it in a geographically relevant way. If we only did it on the Chesapeake, you know, there might not be a reason for the people who live in, let's say, this rural area on the eastern shore to say, well, okay, the bay is doing this, but how's my river? Everyone wants to know how their own backyard's doing. And so this is a way that's geographically relevant to tell folks how the major rivers are doing as well, to give everyone a sense of place when they look at it so they could help make local decisions as well. We used to, as I mentioned earlier, they used to set these really long-term goals of, you know, in '87 they set a goal for 2000, 2000 they set a goal for 2010. The reality is most of those leaders and politicians who are making those decisions were either not in office anymore or not even alive, right, before some of these things would come true. And so there wasn't really accountability for the leadership to make change. So they went to a 2-year milestone. This was as we were approaching 2010, recognizing we weren't going to make the 2010 goal. What would give anyone assurance that we're going to make the 2025 goal? So now we have these 2-year we still have this 2025 goal, and then we have 2-year milestones. Every 2 years we have targets that we're trying to achieve. And so, you know, as I said, the ultimate goal is to meet this total maximum daily load without the feds taking over control. So what are some of the causes of the problems? In yellow is nutrients coming from agriculture. As I said, it's about 40%. This first downside, this is a period between 1985 and 2007. So, you know, we just, instead of having the scale go all the way back, and then you can see the progress from 2007 to 2013. Steady decline, that's good news. And then if you just looked at agriculture, that's that same graph, and we've made a lot more early recent progress in nutrients, in nitrogen. And then you could take this statting program, again, make it very geographically relevant. So now we've taken this very rural area, it happens to be where I work and where I live, so I know it a little bit better. And we can look at nitrogen in that region is about 75%. It's a very low populated area. We only have a couple of wastewater treatment plants. And so about the nitrogen is being sourced from agriculture at about 75%. Of all the nitrogen that's ending up in that river is coming from agricultural community. So we know that's where you got to focus your effort, on agriculture. So if we looked at some of the solutions have to be diverse. So I'm just going to go through, I'm going to pick out a couple of these that had a real large impact. One, back in the late 80s, they removed phosphorus from laundry detergent. And so in all the Bay States, no one has phosphorus in their laundry detergent. These companies really fought it hard. Now in some other states have adopted it. Those who haven't, those same companies kind of said, we have phosphorus-free detergent, it's good for the environment. But initially they were fighting it, now they're using it as a marketing tool. Good for them, all the more power. We had a pretty modest actual fish kill caused by a harmful algal bloom in the mid-90s called Pfiesteria. Out of that came what's called the Water Quality Improvement Act, where every farm in Maryland has to have a nutrient management plan in place that you were not only looking at what you were growing, but if you've grown it in the past, you'd have to have a realistic growth goal. You couldn't just say you were always going to be like the gold standard farmer in your county. You had to show, look, my average of my last 3 best years out of 10 were this much, and therefore my nutrient management plan, I'm going to try to achieve that average of my best of those 3 years. We're now going to what's called a phosphorus management tool, an enhanced way to look at phosphorus management, because the basic premise has always been that soils can't be phosphorus saturated. That's not quite the case. In some areas, particularly in areas where we have a lot of poultry manure that have been repeatedly placed on the land, phosphorus is now soluble and it's moving through the groundwater system, where it hadn't done that in the past. And so we're trying to get a handle of that, and if you're a farm at risk for being saturated in phosphorus, you're not going to be able to use manure anymore as a fertilizer on that farm. So you're going to have to go to inorganic sources. There's a Bay Restoration Fund, which is termed the flush fee. Every homeowner pays a $60 annual fee. That goes to finance upgrades to wastewater treatment plants. Most wastewater treatment plants release about 20 milligrams per liter of nitrogen, and our plants now are almost all are achieving 4 milligrams per liter. So, you know, 1/5 of the amount of nitrogen coming through. We also have a Chesapeake Bay Trust Fund, which is a different funding source that doesn't hit every homeowner, but that's really looking at reducing non-point sources. So cover crops is one of the main ways that we are applying non-point source controls in agriculture. We have a lot of corn production, well, relatively speaking. So Maryland is a relatively small ag state when compared to Iowa. We have 1.1 million acres in crop. So we're really working very closely with the ag community to get cover crops. Many of those acres are corn. You know, they do a corn, soybean, winter wheat rotation, essentially. I may have that rotation wrong, but essentially those are the three biggies. And after corn, you want to put on a cover crop because corn itself leaves a lot of nitrogen in the soil, which then goes down into the groundwater and then flows out into the bay. So these cover crops are applied right after you take down the corn, and it's usually rye. Rye itself in our area doesn't grow agronomically for feed or anything. It doesn't grow well if you don't add a nutrient starter. We don't want to add a nutrient starter. We want it to take up what's left in the soil. You put that down, it still grows, it still takes up a lot of it, and it binds that nitrogen from moving elsewhere. We're also developing a robust nutrient trading program. There is a nutrient trading program on the books with almost no trades because we made it overly complex about who could trade with whom and the geographic scope of that trading. We're trying to eliminate those things so there could be much broader trading between a wastewater treatment plant and agriculture, so that wastewater treatment plants that might be up to their limits and may not be able to expand could pay the agricultural community to do the same nutrient controls that they can't do. So cover crops in Maryland, as I said, 1.1 million acres. We have about 300,000 to 400,000 acres in cover crops per year. That's costing between $9 and $15 million. We are paying the farmers essentially their seed costs or all their costs. What we're not paying them for is essentially the labor costs. But if you minus that out, and then if you live in areas where there's a high likelihood of pollution or a short towpath of pollution from that farm to the bay, we're actually paying bonuses on top of that to really get those farmers engaged, right? Because geographically, where's it coming from? That's going to make the biggest difference, and let's focus our money on that. And so bonus payments is one way to do that. That's kind of revolutionary in Maryland. The Bay itself, with the exception of like the heavy industries from the late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, others may disagree with me on this, but the reality is toxics are not really a problem. Your cobalt and your copper and all that were from the industries of the late 1800s that really whacked the inner harbor and the sediments in the inner harbor, which is by Baltimore, and some areas around Norfolk. But to a large extent, a lot of those toxins are buried deeply in the sediment at this point and don't really come back up. So it's a matter of also wanting to leave that sediment there. So, you know, and they keep getting buried over and you don't have to worry about them as much. So we're looking, these are kind of 2-year, well, not quite 2-year, but these are basically bars where we're always looking at, are we making progress or not? The big bar that's going across up top is the 2017 goal. I should say we have this 2025 goal. 2017, we're going to do a large reevaluation. And so And that means looking at everything. EPA is going to do a large audit in 2017 and then decide if we're making significant progress to meet the 2025 goal. And we expect to be. Phosphorus from all sectors is expected to be below our goal. The one caveat here is some of that new science about phosphorus being transported through the groundwater system when has not fully been taken account. In 2017 it would. We expect perhaps to still be making it, but maybe not as clearly as this graph now shows. For nitrogen, it's going to be really close if we look at all sectors. Some sectors are doing a great job in nutrients in terms of their total reduction. Other sectors are more challenged. So here's an example. 3 main wastewater treatment plants in the region. One is Blue Plains Wastewater Treatment Plant. It's the largest wastewater treatment plant in the world. It serves the DC metropolitan area, including Maryland and Northern Virginia. And that's been running really well. The one challenge is that it's connected with a stormwater system for that same region. So when you get a lot of rain over a short period of time, they have to open the gates. And so then raw sewage is going into the Potomac River, which no one likes. You know, it may only be a very short time, maybe just a couple hours, but if they don't do that, they're going to break the whole system. So what one of the big plans are, very costly, is to build a water storage system under DC. So the rain is first going to go into this underground tunnel, and then slowly, or when the wastewater treatment plant can handle it, send the water there. That's about $1 billion engineering program to store stormwater. It hasn't happened yet. You know, they're still waiting on all the funding. Who knows if it'll really happen. Baltimore also has 2 very large, pretty old wastewater treatment plants. They've been upgraded, but they're due for new upgrades as well. And those are going to have a significant impact in the total amount of nutrients coming from wastewater treatment plant. Agriculture, it's still a real, nitrogen in agriculture is still a real challenge. As I said, we have a lot of manure coming from a lot of the poultry that we're growing, and what to do with that manure has been a real challenge. There's a lot of great emerging technologies. If we're able to get those moving quickly and move manure to energy and other concepts of using it as a different type of resource, we may move closer. But that's been a real challenge. So in conclusion, you know, you need to have a really diverse set of management practices and engage multiple stakeholders in this. I think one of the things that we've had an advantage of, particularly in Maryland, is that the Bay bisects the state. There's major rivers everywhere where you have to go on big, beautiful bridges where you're overlooking the water. To drive 20 minutes, you're going to have to go over one of these bridges almost all the time. And so everyone knows about the Bay, everyone cares about the Bay, everyone's been on the Bay, or everyone wants to be on the Bay. And so the good thing is, from an education standpoint, I can't tell you how many times I walk in a restaurant and if someone, you know, they ask what I do or new friends at a meeting, I get, you know, it's sort of like that doctor, you know, at the cocktail party, or the tax guy around tax time. You know, everyone wants to get their questions in. And it's because everyone really cares deeply about the Bay. We're really lucky in that. It's a struggle, and I recognize the struggle that folks in Pennsylvania who are having to go through this same process, where they're not getting the economic benefits of it, what a challenge it must be for them to make these tough management decisions. Because the citizens aren't seeing that, at least Maryland, we're also getting the positive side of it. We're getting the fisheries out of it. We're getting the beauty out of it, and so forth. So statting has been a really effective tool in applying adaptive management principles, and it's really across agencies working together much more closely than they ever had before. So Department of Agriculture and Department of Environment, one's, you know, mostly there to support agriculture, the other one's there to regulate it, as well as other sources. They're working together in a much more closely manner. Transparency of data, you know, all the data that I've shown is pretty easily found on websites and everywhere else. Keen proponents of making sure data and implementation rates and everything are out there for the public to see. These 2-year milestones have been critical. We now have, you know, current governors on the hook to show progress before they run again, you know, which they weren't under the hook for before. I think that's been key, and I don't mean to just target governors. It's all up and down the line. And when you combine the two of statting and these 2-year milestones, it's been really effective in trying to force some change that we all want to see. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being invited to this conference. It's been this is my second trip specifically to talk about the environment in Iowa. I was here in April and did a series of talks then as well, and I just really appreciate the hospitality that I've been shown in Iowa, and the style and mannerisms that you guys have is really quite different from an East Coaster. And I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. It's a fantastic question, and my institution's played a large role in that. Each year we're growing and planting over 1 billion oysters a year. You know, in a multi-year effort, we've planted essentially 300 acres of oysters, which is a lot, but it's not, you know, we were talking about thousands and thousands of acres of oysters in the past. What we're doing, so 2 things are going on. One, we're trying to plant those oysters in areas where we think they have the best chance of success in the future. 2, I neglected to mention this, but currently, with a stock at 0.3 population, 3% of the population, we still have a public fishery for oysters. Oysters are sort of a fundamental characteristic of the state of Maryland, I guess is one way to put it. And Marylanders, they're really proud of their oysters. And the watermen are really proud fishermen and professionals in what they do. And so it's one of the only public fisheries in the world for oysters. And as I said earlier, the biggest problem with oysters is they don't swim, right? So once you find the goodie pot, you're going to keep going to it. And so we have now established, it took a long time, there used to always be a sanctuary program for oysters, but you had to prove that there weren't oysters living in that sanctuary. So then you're trying to stock an area that may never have historically been good for oysters, for areas that biologists may not understand why, but the reality is they weren't living there. And so that's kind of where some efforts were going. Now, our previous governor took a pretty bold step, and essentially about 20% of the public bars are now considered sanctuaries, and that's where our restocking efforts are focused. Without getting too complicated, oyster larvae swim. So an oyster egg gets fertilized, goes into a larval stage, that swims around. What we're looking at doing and looking at the physics of the bay and the biology of the oyster larvae, we're able to predict where these sanctuaries should be that would help produce oysters in public bars as well as back in the sanctuaries. So you're not putting them kind of in an area where wherever they spawn, they're not going to help the future populations, because you could do that. So that might also be considered a waste. So we're really using this smart restoration with oysters. The market size is 3 inches. It takes about a 2 to 4 year period. And the oyster itself becomes sexually mature between 1 year and 2 years, depending upon the conditions. Great question. Very few fish farms. There's some aquaculture, but it's usually done at a pretty modest level. The primary fish, the primary market fish is striped bass. High dollar, high market, a lot of them out there. The largest fishery is actually menhaden. But humans don't consume menhaden. Menhaden's used to make fish oil, and also traditionally it was in chicken feed, very little in chicken feed today, but it's used as a protein supplement, essentially. But there's a large menhaden fishery in the bay. And then blue crabs, high dollar. Their biology is also confusing. It's a cool little story, but basically the adult crabs go down to the mouth of the bay, they spawn, the eggs go out into the ocean, that larvae then has to figure out how to get back in the bay. And they do it, and they do it really well. The other good thing about crabs is that they produce millions and millions of eggs, and they could get sexually mature within 1 year. They might be pre-market size. If they're a fast grower, they're going to be spawning within a year, which is great. From a fishery perspective, that's a really good fish you want. A really bad fish is a sturgeon, which takes about 15 years to become sexually mature. They're about 200 pounds at that time. Their eggs, you know, are great, and the meat was great. So you wanted to eat this caviar coming from the sturgeon, so people were eating the eggs. You know, and they were slow growing, huge fish, lots of meat. You find them, you want to eat them right away. And that fishery also declined in the late 1800s, but that was just because their biology just didn't match kind of humans, human needs. So wildlife can have a pretty big local impact. So this is also great goose hunting territory for a reason, because it's a major flyway and stopping ground, particularly for snow geese and Canadian geese that actually come from Canada besides our resident geese. So locally, those populations can have a huge impact. Now, presumably, when that farmer takes an annual soil sample, you know, that manure, if those geese are hanging out on farms, that'll be there, right? If they're not on farms, they might not get captured. So if they are on your big green spaces and stuff, that may well be a source. We've looked at source tracking. It's very costly. I'm sure new technologies are coming on board. You can look at E. coli and, you know, track the E. coli of whether it's pets, whether it's geese, whether it's humans, or what the source is. It's just very expensive, and it changes in very small geographic timescales. So you know, if you measure it by that one area, that's all you could really talk about, because if you move, you know, a mile away, it could be completely different. Mostly first of all, our watershed size is 64,000 square miles. The most of the stormwater systems are in the highly populated region. So every town and city has stormwater systems, and then when you get to the rural areas, we have swale systems, basically just to get the water off the road for human safety. In areas where I'm in, we're very low. You know, Maryland itself is a relatively flat state, and then on this Delmarva Peninsula where I'm on, it's extremely flat. And so our swale systems are basically tidal systems, or storm systems both directions. So if we get a big storm surge, that water's flowing up into those systems. So it's not a really great mitigator of nutrients on the way down. We also have to ditch. We have very few tile drain ag systems in Maryland. Most of it is just swales within your farm, and depending upon how low the water table is where you are, that could be about maybe every 100 feet there might be a swale. So we've done grass buffers along those areas, pretty extensive grass buffer systems. I was kind of surprised when I came to Iowa, and a lot of people were really upset by this lawsuit, because at least on the East Coast, everyone sues everyone pretty quickly. You know, so I was kind of surprised. I was kind of surprised that everyone kind of took it sort of personally, you know. And that's no offense to the culture here. It's just a different culture than we're in. You know, having good dialogue, even if one's suing another, it's trying to get there. So one point I'll make on this, and I've worked closely with the Department of Environment and the Secretary of the Department of Environment, who in Maryland would say, maybe not publicly, but even publicly, he needs the advocacy groups sometimes to sue his agency to help affect change, because there's either not the political will or the funding that's really going to support the actions that the law requires. So sometimes it's because there's a law there that's really not funded. And so an advocacy group comes in and say, you're not following the law. And he says, you know what, you're right. But the legislature gave me the law, but they didn't give me the funding source to implement it. So I think in some of those instances, and stormwater is one of those where that is more common, particularly in the city of Baltimore, where the city of Baltimore is a very old city. Their stormwater systems, basically they took all their rivers and they paved the rivers and they even put them under the city. So all the rivers are all paved, and there are no sunlight, and they're all just flowing under the city. As part of the stormwater system, that's completely kind of uncontrolled, that's going in then to that upper part of the bay. And so what's coming off those roads, it's highly paved area, highly urbanized areas, is going right in, and there's no greening of that water beforehand. So there's no way to take up those nutrients beforehand. And so they're under a lot of restrictions that are hopefully helping to improve the system. And it's not going to be cheap and easy to do it. There are some people that are pretty frustrated that we haven't quite gotten there yet, because we have spent a lot of money. I mean, relatively speaking, we've spent a lot of money on this. And I think we probably lost about 5 or 10 years in saying we're spending a lot of money, therefore there must be positive change, without really looking at the changes. I think if we meet our nutrient goals, let me just step back a bit. We've seen significant improvements in the bay already from where it was in the 70s and 80s, both in water, just in water quality itself, while having really high population growth over that same period of time. So the nutrients per capita, per individual that's in there has been drastically going down. The improvements to the wastewater treatment plants have really impacted the local waterways that used to be really poorly impacted from the load that was coming right out of that wastewater treatment plant. So a nice, healthy, or nice river that had a huge plant, wastewater treatment plant on it, immediately became a degraded system. With these engineering fixes, that's pretty rapid. Where it's slow is on the non-point sources, right? So some of our groundwater towpaths take between 10 and 20 years before we expect to see a change of the water coming out of the groundwater. So are what we're measuring today, are they from actions that were done last year, 5 years ago, or 20 years ago? And that's a really hard thing to understand and measure. I'll also say this is water clarity, how deep you could see the water, vastly improved this year. One of the scary things are, scientists don't know why it got so good so quickly. What happened, right? But we have seen some positive changes in the past few years, and all of a sudden it went through this major positive increase. We know we had a lot of bay grass in the bay this year, and grasses, as you know on your own farm, they slow down the water, particles could come out, and it holds the soil really well. And we think the bay underwater grasses function very much the same way, really good population this year, and by the fall the water was extremely clear. So much so, I've been in this region since the late 80s. I've been amazed when I've looked out at piers that I've been going to for years, and I could see the bottom. Never happened